Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's CDCT live session. I'm Jason Rader, and I'll be your host today as we talk about data loss prevention and the role of data governance, discovery, and classification. With me today, we've got some experts that are going to make this conversation really fun. We've got Phil D'Angio, who's the VP and Insider Risk Solutions, or VP of Data and Insider Risk Solutions from ForcePoint. We've got Mansoor Farani, who's our senior GRC consultant here with us here at CDCT, and Michael Peralt, senior security architect here with us as well. Welcome, gentlemen. Glad to have you.
Nice to be here, Jason.
All right, so that was a long title. And I think we got to break it down and kind of set the stage for the folks that are out there. What do we mean, or let's talk about, should we talk about data protection and then maybe the life cycle? Who wants to take that? Why don't you go, Peralt?
Sounds like a good place to start. I mean, I think data protection these days is getting wrapped up in just the kind of the end state of data protection. How do we protect backups and stuff like that? And I think it needs to be discussed in kind of a broader context. And hopefully we can do a little bit of that here today.
Oh, were you going to take us through the data lifecycle? I'm sorry.
Oh, everything from data creation to data handling, data classification, data protection, data destruction, et cetera. I mean, there's a whole life cycle around data just in general, and various. I think there's various protections at each one of those stages, and I think if we dig into that a little bit, I think we'll have a better idea about how some of those protections actually come to be.
Yeah, and I think, data is, first of all, not going away. And after all of the fun stuff that's gone down to the pandemic, there's probably data in more disparate places than we expected to have it. And this, I think, as folks are coming back around, now that it seems that we're getting back to potentially to the way that we're going to be operating moving forward, but it's not going to be exactly the same. We're kind of evaluating kind of the approach on that data. But I think before we even get to the controls aspect of starting to figure out what controls need to be put into place, maybe we should think a little bit about data classification and talk a little bit about that first. Mansoor, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Jason. Data governance requires a strategic approach, an organization-wide approach. Data is, as we all know, is handled by all functional areas in our organization. And that data has to be discovered. Normally, there has to be formal processes to discover not only electronic data, but also physical copies of the data. And it has to be classified and it has to be labeled. There has to be policies and procedures that communicate how that each class of data, each data type, how it should be handled by various functional areas of the organization. So I couldn't agree with you more. There has to be a formal process in place for discovery, classification, and labeling of data.
So you just talked about a whole lot of stuff: discovery, classification, labeling, defining the handling and all of those things. I've worked for a lot of Fortune 500 companies, and I've consult with a lot of them as well. I rarely see the full implementation of what we just talked about. Why do you think that's such a big issue, Phil?
I think it's a moving target, and it always will be. Exactly. To your earlier point, the discovery process and the classification, and candidly, to Peralt's point, descoping or destruction is it's an into perpetuity equation that we need to solve for, and then you end up doing it differently. Some of the organizations we work with have a problem doing it in the cloud versus in their data center at the desktop. All these different scenarios, ending up with multiple tools is difficult. It's just difficult, and
yeah.
I think the biggest thing I worry about, if from a CISO perspective, if I put that lens on, is how good is good enough? Because you're never
Exactly.
going to be perfect. How do you measure good enough? And I don't have the answer. I'd love to hear other people's perspective on what good enough looks like.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And this is, data classification is near and dear to my heart. It's one of those things that, you understand that if this thing can be done, good stuff will happen, right? But it's not just, there's, everybody go do a Google search, find the methodology. I mean, it's pretty straightforward, right? But getting an organization to go through that massive effort to define those different categories of data that they've got, whether they're going against regulatory requirements or regardless of what it is, doing that, defining the schema, the controls that need to be aligned with each of the classification levels, doing the awareness that's appropriate, then going out and discovering all the data, labeling it and categorizing it and all of the fun stuff. And then, of course, going through the end users, handling it appropriately, enforcing that. That's a giant effort. And if you went through all of that up until the point of, it's a giant effort, and then you don't get anything good right at the end of the data classification process. The good comes with how your users handle it and how the data is managed moving forward. So it's really hard to get an organization talked into that, if you will. So that's what one of the struggles is. You understand the benefit, but it takes a lot of effort. And I think people lose hope. It just never gets put completely into practice, to your point, Phil.
Jason, I've worked with an organization in the past that we did that exercise. We looked at all the channels in the organization that were handling sensitive information. When we identified 400 plus processes that were handling their sensitive data. So as part of that, what we did, we took a step back and identified those processes, mapped them, and then developed strategies on how we can actually minimize those number of processes, because each process creates another risk for the organization. So we implemented solutions that would, we did some process elimination, processes that they were redundant and unneeded. We did process consolidation. We got rid of intermediary steps for one process that they were not necessary. And as a result of that, we made the organization leaner and more efficient. Even the business processes became more efficient because we eliminated some of the processes.
Now, that's a good point. And your audio is cutting a little in and out, Mansoor.
Okay.
And I think back to Phil's earlier thing, what's kind of good enough and what do you get those, I think in the past, again, back to kind of where we sit from the way that we're going to operate moving forward, everybody kind of put these perimeter controls in place. I can think of definitely one organization I worked for in the past that, we just kept everything in a big place, a giant blob of data, and we just put controls around that. But now that's not an option anymore. I mean, there's all of the places the data is going to sit. We don't work that way. And to Mansoor's point, now we got to pay a lot of attention to the different workloads that are touching this data, and streamlining those processes, because that's one of the first things that people want to talk about when they're talking about moving workloads to the cloud is, okay, well, what are you moving to the cloud? What data is being processed by this workload? Can you, or, is that part of your data governance model to even be able to put these things in the cloud?
Well, I don't think it's a can you, it's a should you.
I always use the Jurassic Park quote. We worked on it whether we could. We didn't think about whether we should. That is, it's one of those things where so what do we do? Is it get out of the security business? Is that your advice? Phil, you were talking about from a CISO perspective.
No, I think, no, your data is pretty much, on 90% of the world runs their company on their data, so your data is your growth engine, and the people are interacting with it to drive growth. So you're stuck.
Yep.
You've got to find the happy medium. I think good enough and best in class are kind of the two places you want to figure out where you want to be. You don't want to be anywhere behind the good enough bar. And for me, I think, as we talked about a little bit here today, you got to A, figure out where you are, and B, figure out where you want to go and how fast you need to get from A to B, and what things you need to do internally to build momentum. For me, the biggest challenge for getting a program off the ground is always getting stakeholder buy-in and understanding of what risk looks like where we are today versus where we're going. When you start filtering in the company's strategy to grow, that's where it gets complicated. So if for example, a company has an initiative to be SaaS first or cloud first, and they're not today, and you need to get to a posture of stronger risk mitigation while that transition is happening. Either you have an advantage or you have a big disadvantage. Depends on where your data is and how much of the sensitive data needs to be transferred to that cloud environment. You got a lot of little nuances that you got to figure out. That's why, I think every situation is unique to me.
No, and you brought up a good point. I was going to actually throw a question at you. I think you already answered it though, because, being from ForcePoint, I was going to say, do you think it's all just a technology solution? And you already answered that. It's not, right? You've got and to think that you have to explain risk and get a consensus amongst the organization to understand that is something that's kind of foreign to a lot of folks, right? You've got to come in and help these guys understand how can we even measure this or even relate it back to the business of where we want to go and how we're going to grow and how this affects the business if we don't at least have something that we can start from.
It's absolutely not a technology issue. It's 100% a business issue. That's why I love the space. I love, whether it's insider risk or it's data protection programs, which I think really should be converged into one narrative. It's all about data risk and what you can live with and what you can't. What is your competitive advantage and how much is that worth if it goes out the door regularly? That was one of my favorite conversations is what's a record worth? You have the Poneman IBM study that tells you what the records are worth on average, out in the market. I love that study because it gives our customers a benchmark. But then if you start to get into the depth of what a record is worth or what a document, what IP is worth in an organization, that's where stuff starts to make a lot more sense to the stakeholders beyond security. Our stakeholders from security should be the business owners that are the ones driving growth. And if they buy in to a model that identifies what risk looks like for their IP, then the conversation shifts completely away from tech because it's a program then.
Yep, absolutely. What do you find, Michael, is when you're dealing with folks, do you feel that we typically deal with the security entry points within an organization. Do you feel that they are having difficulty kind of expressing this back to the senior levels of the organization, or do you feel that it's just a conversation they haven't had yet?
I find both of those to be true, actually. Sometimes it's a conversation they haven't had, and sometimes there's a distinct difficulty in actually communicating what the overall risk to the data is and what the monetary values of that are back to the business. It is not frequently well understood what a record is worth to the organization, or in a lot of cases even how much it costs to maintain that record over time. Those are not well understood metrics. Most organizations don't collect them, and therefore they don't communicate them very well back to the business.
Yeah, well, at least, security is one of the hardest things to quantify. At least we do have some kind of angle that Phil was talking about and you're talking about there. But I always argue about this, how you relate, how you can deal with the business, the lines of business within an organization and the executives. It's difficult at best. And coming up with that way that you can help them understand how it's going to affect them. And Mansoor, I was going to ask you, I see loads of folks these days that, your earlier point was you go through an organization and you streamline those processes and get people out. But what I hear a lot of folks saying is, and I don't think I think they're making the statement the way that they typically do of we want to move everything to the cloud without thinking of what the implications are. But I hear a lot of people, I'm like, oh, well, you need to get rid of this data. You're not using it. They're like, no. We want to save that data for analytics. Are you running into those guys?
Yeah, and I admit that I was one of those individuals because in my prior role, I was a data scientist. I was heading data analytic teams. The more data, historical data you have, the more credible is your statistical model. And because of that, I wanted to keep all the data that exists. And but yes, that's very true. Data hoarding is an issue, but I think it's the organizations that I've worked with, communicating with these individuals with the business areas, to letting them know that there has to be a business, legal, or compliance justification for retention of sensitive data. If there is none, that organization or that process or that division will have some sort of, it's going to violate privacy or cybersecurity law and regulation. If you look at PCI, HIPAA, HITRUST, CMMC, all of these cybersecurity and privacy laws and regulations, they mandate that you got to have justification for the retention or handling of that information. So taking that back to the business divisions and working with them to make sure that there is a justification for the data. Otherwise, the data shouldn't exist in the organization.
Gotcha. Thanks. I'm having trouble still catching your audios. I don't know if it's just me or not. And I think, so that kind of leads me to, I think, the sub heading of this, which is insider risk. Phil, when you were talking about insider risk and you talked about those things kind of converging together, what do you mean when you say that?
Well, data protection is exactly what it sounds like. Typically, you're looking to protect the data. Insider risk is to put a fine point on it, is typically all about visibility into individuals that are either representing risk around fraud, collusion, in some cases conduct risk, but ultimately, by the way, it can also be nation-state actors, corporate espionage. You're looking for some very specific scenarios that are behavioral centric. My belief is that standalone program or function of insider risk and the data protection programs are going to more and more converge. Frankly, I see it all the time now.
Sure.
But I'm a card-carrying member of the group that believes those should be really in cahoots with one another from a program and from a tooling perspective. If you can see risky behavior and you can analyze it and do something about it, then you can really reduce the risk fabric inside the system. And so that's where I see the puck is going in that direction. I see there's a great way for customers, and in my opinion, just organizations generally speaking, to get more bang for their buck by merging those approaches. Getting beyond visibility is really, I think, the key thing for insider risk programs, being able to do something about risk when you see it. The other thing I'll leave you on this topic is there's just a common sense element of it. Insider risk and data protection use cases, 9 out of 10, data exfiltration. So that overlap is too strong for us to ignore it at this point.
No, I think that's a good point. We run into a lot of folks, whether it's fair to say or not, you get into the bigger the organization, the more compartmentalized the different roles are. And, what you just said makes absolute perfect sense to me. Putting it in practice with, even they use different tech to do the things that I think the tech should be merged in a lot of cases. I mean, completely different GRC systems sometimes for I'm like, these things can go together. Right?
The biggest challenge to me is the efficiency or the inefficiency of them operating independently. Okay, I'm going to run an investigation on a group or a set of individuals because of some signals we got. Okay, well, I'm going to go to HR, I'm going to go to GRC, and I'm going to go to DLP. Often you're going to go right to DLP. So I'm going to go partner with my data protection partners, and I'm going to find most of the good stuff there, or I'm going to pull some stuff out of the SIM. I'm saying, look, you've got a UAM tool, you got a DLP tool. The overlap again is so strong there. Let's get efficient about it, and then ultimately, UAM tools typically don't have a mechanism to take action or control the risk. That's what I love about the SASE architectures that are coming out. Some of the zero trust architectures. You're getting visibility, you get analysis, and then you can do something about it with those controls. Now we're starting to get ahead of it and being able to instrument some automation around some friction that makes sense. And I'm not talking about blocks. I'm talking about, let's ask the user, you sure you want to do that? If you're well-meaning or you're malicious, that friction is going to give you pause, and then there's behaviors that will indicate things that show us what that user is up to after the fact. And there's always going to be signals, whether they're nefarious or not.
Yeah, you just brought up something that, kind of my mantra, being a computer hackery kind of person in my background, right? Not a black hat, but a white hat, of course. We always kind of talk about when we talk about DLP, and you talked about data exfil being the big thing. DLP, and you just said, if it's going to ask a user, do you want to do this or not? Well, the bad guys are going to go, yes, I do want to do this, right?
That's right.
So DLP, a lot of folks, to your point, and I know Michael and Mansoor can kind of roll with me on this, is that they think that DLP is all they need to kind of deal with this data protection thing. What do you guys think about that? I mean, and how do you kind of help people through that journey? Anyone?
Yeah, DLP is a great tool set. By itself, if you don't have all the rest of the parts and pieces in place, though, it's really kind of ineffective. Without proper data classification, proper data handling, you don't have the right definitions. You don't know where your data lives or resides. And building out, basically, if you don't have this stuff, everything is a corner case. And implementing any sort of technology on a collection of corner cases is hugely inefficient and problematic. You're going to miss stuff. So that's one of the bigger challenges. It's not necessarily in the technology; it's in the operational processes and procedures that organizations are adopting, or more to the point, not adopting a lot of times.
No, I love that. And, again, not everything's obviously a nefarious angle. I think we took a poll or a survey recently from our folks out here that are watching right now, and the overwhelming majority of them said that it was user error what was responsible for the vast majority of data leakage problems. So I think, again, operationally implemented correctly, DLP is a great solution, assuming that that's your deal. But I think without any of the user analytics, you're missing half of the issue there, right? That's how you catch the nefarious side.
Yeah, I think
Is that fair?
What I would say about that in my experience is scale matters a lot. So
Yes.
the variety of user interactions with data is very important to take in consideration with what I'm about to say. DLP gives you great visibility and it gives you control, but it lacks the context of what's going on beyond
Right.
users' interaction with your data. So being able to getting to a point of comfort to pick controls without that context is really difficult as soon as you get beyond thousands of users. You get into tens of thousands of users or hundreds of thousands of users, it becomes an extremely difficult game to play without that context. And so as you mature towards data and insider risk postures that are proactive about managing the risk, I think it's important that you have all of that context around the behavior and the abnormality or clear signals of risk, like I've resigned and I've clearly applied for other jobs, and if you know for sure the person's leaving, let's tighten controls. It's as simple as that.
For sure. No, and I think so. The integration, especially when we talked about the compartmentalization of the organizations, and they both different sides can benefit from this. The implementation of the technology that you're going to use as part of this solution is important as well. So how easily adopted do you think these solutions are? And of course, you can comment related to your own, Phil.
Complicated, and it's a daunting task, regardless of your size or your complexity, and your cloud journey, of course, depending on where you are. It's just a variety, right? I mean, it's just like anything in life. It's a variety of challenges, and you gotta find the right combination. I don't have any belief that it's a tech issue. It's a culture issue. It's a business issue. Those two things together, if you can get the culture right inside the company. I was at a customer about a year ago, and they said we're very much a trust culture, really bad for data protection program.
That was their solution. We trust everybody. There you go.
Trust everyone to do the right thing. Is very sort of parochial to think that that's the right angle. But at the same time, they were asking us about best practices for insider risk. I said it's certainly not to trust everyone. So we've got to find some common ground where monitoring is something that's acceptable from an executive perspective, and that monitoring, from my personal point of view, needs to be applied equally. You get into some very difficult conversations if monitoring isn't applied in a consistent manner across the organization.
We definitely hit some hot buttons there if we're not applying it across, especially in other countries, even more so than the one that we're in right now. So along those cultural lines, I mean, I think every single engagement that we're running into right now, there's a cultural piece to this thing. There's a lot of engagement that senior leadership, you've got top-down organizations, you got bottom-up organizations, but this isn't necessarily, in my opinion, something that can be done from a bottom-up. This has got to have some engagement from leadership. What kind of advice are we giving to those folks, Mansoor? I feel like we coach a lot of senior leaders as far as this goes.
Yeah, exactly. And if I have any audio issues, just let me know, please. But absolutely, Jason. When I work with clients, I always say data governance, like Phil was mentioning, it is a strategic business initiative of an organization. It requires board of directors and executive management oversight. I couldn't agree with you more that it is really a top-down approach, because it can have a significant impact on the organization. We know the cost of compromise per record is $240 plus dollars, depending on who you ask, but it's a significant cost. And that's only the explicit cost. The implicit cost of damaging the reputation of the company and creating ill will with the customers, partners, I mean, that's even the ones that cannot be measured, and it could be significant to the organization. So when we work with our clients, we do encourage that we do speak with the executive management to understand what their goals and objectives are, and then whatever implementation in terms of strategies and tactical implementations, that it's going to be in support of that corporate vision, in support of that strategic vision that the senior executives of the organizations define.
Thank you. And we can hear you great now.
Okay, great.
Michael, any comments on that, please?
Yeah, I'd like to just add something to that real quick. I think one of the things that we see a lot of times when we're rolling this out or getting this adopted within organizations, we usually have a lot of buy-in from the leadership perspective. They understand why it's important. They understand why they're doing this. What we're not so good at, in broad terms, is seeing that communicated out to the rank and file users.
Great.
They don't really, it's a hassle, it's an impediment, it's something that gets in their way. They don't understand why it's there, and they don't understand really what it's doing to protect not only them, but their organization. And I think we need to get better at bridging that gap between the average workers that are using this stuff every day and the overall direction of upper management stakeholders with this technology. I think if we can manage to do that successfully, we're going to see a lot better outcomes.
That is a fantastic point, because I think you're absolutely right. We talk to a lot of boards, a lot of executives, and those folks are on board. They obviously, it'd be silly for them to not be on board with protecting the organization's data from any perspective. But I do think there's a point in every organization where that doesn't make its way down, and we do have to do a better job of explaining, helping folks believe, what their role is within the whole process. Because, I mean, again, even if it's programmatically implemented, like in some, suites, you can have it so that the labeling is a default label, and then the user has to change the label within the client as they use or create the data. But if they just accept the default label every time, regardless of what's in there, I mean, they're kind of affecting the whole process in general, right? So I completely agree. So we've set the stage, right? This is not easy. There's some cultural things that definitely have to go on and be addressed within the overall organization. what we'll close with is how do we get started? Or if you feel like folks are, it's always unfair to say, where do you get started? Because I doubt anybody's listening to this out there going, I maybe should do some of this stuff. They're all probably trying to deal with it in some form or fashion. We'll go around and we'll end with Phil. What's your advice to these folks? Michael?
Take stock of where you are currently, figure out where you want to be, and chart a path between those two. Everybody's at a different stage in this whole thing, and I think that's the biggest gap we normally find is we'll start talking to somebody about data protection or DLP or where they're at in their data lifecycle management, and everybody's at a different point. And it's usually not well understood within the organization where specifically they are. Different groups, different people have different thoughts about where they are, and that doesn't always necessarily align. So figuring out where you are right now is probably the biggest thing that we see organizations struggle with, and getting that data point and then figuring out where we want to be is probably the biggest thing that I see as a gap. Because it is a journey, like Phil was talking about. It's an ongoing thing. It always changes. It's never the same. There's always changing requirements, changing data, changing applications, and so it's something that's got to be revisited. There's no point. It's like security. There's no point that you can just stick a pin in data stuff and say, we nailed it. We're done. Yeah. It's an ongoing journey.
We did that last year. Yeah, we got security covered. Mansoor, what are your thoughts?
So very much in line with what Michael just said, identifying which external laws and regulations the organization is subject to, what are the internal goals and objectives of the executive management, and like we discussed just a few minutes ago, identifying those, understanding what are the third-party obligations that the organization have. That identification of external and internal requirements would help the organization identify what the overall strategy should be in order to comply with those, and then implementing formal processes for where they are to identify where they are today and where they want to be, and what measures they need to implement in order to fill the gap. I think that's would be a great starting point.
No, thank you.
All wisdom I buy into and agree with. I'll just be brief and say, the thing I would always recommend is that the data and insider risk program managers, the CISOs, align with their priorities in those initiatives with the business, and to always verify what is the priority around use cases or investments aligns to what drives growth for the company. Those line of business relationships are the true north for what we're doing and what we're not doing inside those programs. So thanks, and thanks Jason and team for having me.
Oh, we were glad to have you. Thanks for contributing. And just final words from me. I think it's the things that we're going through right now with this particular problem. It's worth the investment to take it to, while we're dealing with the tactical aspects, that compartmentalization. It's worth the investment to make it a bigger solution, to take these things and go through the effort to deal with the things that aren't technology related to get this done, because it's only going to benefit the organization, and it'll create that culture as we move forward that's going to help us in a lot of other areas. It's worth it. Gentlemen, it's been a lot of fun, and thanks so much for joining us. If you guys out there would like to hear more about what we do, please visit us at insightcdct.com. And we'd love to thank Phil and ForcePoint for joining us today. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks all.